Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see so many people here. And we have a wonderful day planned, a wonderful morning planned with a wonderful panel, and of course the topic that is right on target for what we're talking about today in our environment and in our businesses. I'm Murray Feldman, WWJ News Radio 950, and it's an honor to welcome you here and to tell you that we are proud to be a sponsor of the Executive Speaker Series for this year as we go into our 8th year here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. As we kick off another season, we have a long history of programs that we have participated in with U of M and U of M Dearborn. Some of them are on the air, some of them are off the air, just like this one is. This forum, of course, is where we discuss critical economic and business issues. And on that note, I'm happy to introduce you to my friend, Dean Raju Balakrishnan, who is the Dean of the College of Business here at University of Michigan-Dearborn. And I say my friend because he was nice enough to take part of his summer to come and be with us on the air on WWJ and explain some of the wonderful programs that are going on this campus here, especially how to save students money, which is a topic everybody wants to talk about. But that is for another day. This one is about regulation. Dean, all yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Murray, and we are thrilled to be partnering with WWJ 950 as part of this Executive Speaker Series. As Murray said, my name is Raju Balakrishnan. It is my privilege to serve as the Dean of the College of Business at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. And let me take this opportunity to welcome you all to the first event of the 2017-18 College of Business Executive Speaker Series. Today's topic is the effects of changing regulations on business competitiveness. This speaker series is now in its 7th year, and I am thrilled to see a full room because it has clearly become a signature event not only for the College of Business, but for the entire University of Michigan-Dearborn. At the outset, I would like to thank DFCU Financial for sponsoring this event. This is the 4th year that they have been our valuable partners in this initiative, and we greatly appreciate their continued support. While I would love to take this opportunity to spend some time bragging about the college and especially our outstanding students, I know that you all didn't come here at 8 o'clock to hear a long speech from me. So I just have 18 pages that I will quickly go through now. I will keep it very short. So let me just spend a few remarks on today's topic. Last March, CNBC discussed the possibility of having a successful deregulation campaign to improve U.S. business competitiveness in global markets. A panel of Fortune 500 CEOs reached 3 conclusions. First, businesses are overwhelmed and overburdened by government regulation. Second, the potential for less regulation was a key factor in increased hiring by U.S. businesses. Third, they did not expect significant improvement on deregulation until the summer of 2018. The benefit of government regulation is to provide protection and fairness to individuals, the environment, and organizations. However, in 2016, the estimated annual cost of government regulation hit $2 trillion, that trillion with a T. For some businesses, the cost of regulation compliance, direct or hidden, exceeds their annual federal tax liability. At its peak in 2015, and this was staggering, the federal government issued 81,611 pages for 3,378 new regulations. With the current, I lost my page here. Okay, with the current annual cost of regulation now estimated at $20,000 per American worker. The federal government is now considering deregulation, tax reform, income repatriation, and changes to specific regulations. We now attempt to step back from all the political hype and wins. The purpose of today's panel is to discuss how we can balance the cost to business of regulation with its benefit to the public. What regulations can actually be streamlined, amended, or eliminated? Are there regulations that should simply be taken off the table? And how can we use this process to improve the business environment in the US? We have an outstanding panel discussing these issues today, and so it should be a very interesting discussion indeed. Once again, thank you all for taking the time this morning to join us. At this time, I would like to introduce Michael Kruchek. Chief Lending Officer of DFCU Financial, to say a few words. Michael?
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this exciting event. Small businesses are the heart and soul of America's economy. They are on the front lines of commerce, driving economic growth while boosting job creation and innovation. 2 years ago, DFCU Financial began offering business loans and products to small businesses with annual net revenue of less than $5 million. We recognize that this sector was often underserved by large financial institutions, and we worked with a committee of small business owners to develop the products and services that would meet their needs. Small businesses, unfortunately, are among the first in the economy to feel the effects of slow growth or change in policy. For that reason, it's critical to address the obstacles in the way of entrepreneurs, starting with regulation and its disproportionate impact on entrepreneurship in America. Just a few interesting statistics. More than 45% of the U.S. gross domestic product is driven by the small business sector. Historically, small businesses have been responsible for 2/3 of all net jobs. And each year, more than 500,000 new business establishments are launched, creating more than 2.5 million jobs. This makes these entities a key piece of the American economy, playing a critical role in its success and growth. DFCU Financial is pleased to sponsor this speaker seminar series today and other efforts on behalf of small businesses in this and other communities throughout the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. And by the way, it's great to work with you again. We've participated in a number of programs on air and off air over the last couple of years with DFCU Financial, so it's great to be partnering with you here today as well. All right, we have a wonderful panel. I want to introduce them to you now, and then we're going to let the discussion begin. Welcome Diane Dawson, Chief Tax Officer, Ford Motor Company, global responsibility for tax compliance, tax audits, appeals and litigation, and tax planning for direct and indirect taxes. Also responsible for financial reporting of taxes, transfer pricing, and employee benefits. These responsibilities extend to Ford's automotive and financial services businesses. Diane has been employed by Ford Motor Company since her graduation from the University of Michigan Law School in 1979, which followed her graduation from Valparaiso University with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, Accounting. Diane serves on the board of directors of Accounting Aid Society, through which the Ford Tax Office has provided volunteer income tax preparation assistance to low-income Detroiters for nearly 20 years. Welcome, Diane. Thanks for being here. Jeff Jewell is Vice President and Controller for DTE Energy, serving 2.1 million electric and 1.2 million natural gas customers in Michigan. He joined DTE Energy in 2005. Prior positions in DTE include service as the Chief Risk Officer and Controller for DTE Electric. His prior experience includes various financial and risk management positions with Ernst & Young, Koch Industries, Duke Energy Corporation. He earned a Bachelor of Business Administration degree in accounting and a Bachelor of Science degree in agricultural economics from Texas A&M University and a Master's in Finance from the University of Michigan-Dearborn. He is also a retired captain of the U.S. Army Reserves. Jeff is a board member of the First Tee of Greater Detroit, a member of Global Association of Risk Professionals. He also serves on the University of Michigan-Dearborn's College of Business Board of Advisors. Jeff, welcome and thank you for being here. Terry Takai is the Executive Director of the Center for Digital Government, member of the First Net Board, and a member of several industry advisory boards. She also serves on the University of Michigan-Dearborn's College of Business Board of Advisors. Previously, she worked for Ford Motor Company for 30 years in global application development and information technology strategic planning. From Ford, she moved to EDS in support of General Motors. A longtime interest in public service led her to the government sector, holding CIO positions with the state of Michigan, the state of California, and the U.S. Department of Defense. Terry has won numerous awards, including Governing Magazine's Public Official of the Year, CIO Magazine's CIO Hall of Fame, Government Technology Magazine's Top 25 Doers, Dreamers, and Drivers, the Women in Defense Excellence and Leadership Award, and the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. Terry holds a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics from the University of Michigan-Dearborn and a Master's in Management from the University of Michigan. Terry, thank you for being here. Paul Traub currently holds the position of Senior Business Economist at the Detroit branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, where his responsibilities include both research and current analysis. Prior to joining the Economic Research Department of the Chicago Fed, he was the president of Scenario Economics, LLC, and senior economist for America's Commercial Transportation Research Company, LLC, ACT Research. He also worked for 25 years at Chrysler, LLC, as a corporate economist, where his responsibilities included tracking the economy and forecasting the impact on North American automobile sales from coast to coast. I think we quoted you several times on the air, by the way, in that position. He currently is on the board of directors of the Detroit Association of Business Economists, member of the National Association of Business Economists and the Detroit Economic Club. He holds a BBA from the University of Michigan-Dearborn and an MBA from Oakland University. Thank you, Paul, for being here with us. And the man behind it all, who will set the discussion in motion, Dr. Brian Green, CPA, full professor, and the Zarnecki Collegiate Professor of Accounting. He earned his PhD in 1991 from Kent State University. Since that time, he's received many honors, including both the Michigan Associate of CPA's Distinguished Achievement in Accounting Education and Accounting Educator of the Year Awards, the College of Business's Distinguished Researcher, Teacher of the Year Awards, and the university's Distinguished Faculty Research Award. Last spring, he received the university's Distinguished Teaching Award. He is also the founder and director of this Executive Speaker Series. And for that, we say congratulations on so many years of successful events here, and good luck on this one. We're off to a great start today. Brian.
Okay, with an introduction like that, I can't mess up now. Okay, good. Good morning. I can tell some of these are my students, they respond to that. That's good. Yeah, we have a very good panel, and we purposely had panelists from a variety of industries because it's not regulation and industry, it's regulation and business. So I just want to start out with asking the panelists about, from their organization's viewpoint, what contacts they have with regulation, their dealings with regulations, and just their general thoughts on the regulation environment for U.S. businesses, just as a general opening question.
Want to start from the one end or the other, or
Anyone who wants to start can
Whatever.
start.
Well, I can start. Well, I am from Ford Motor Company, and by the way, this is hard to keep audience contact from here to here, so apologies. But I am from Ford, but I am not an engineer. I do not deal with the product. I know enough to be dangerous, but my role for my entire career has been in tax. And tax, of course, is made of rules, mostly made by Congress, but regulators fill in the gaps. But they are mostly designed not to engineer behavior. They're mostly designed to raise revenue to fund the government. So it's not regulatory environment the way some of my fellow panelists will discuss. But the tax system is used kind of indirectly to affect behavior, sometimes for the positive, like you might get a credit if you replace your inefficient refrigerator with a new refrigerator. It doesn't mean you have to, right? It's not a regulation that says buy a new refrigerator, but it's an incentive. Or there could be sales tax incentives for back to school shopping, all kinds of kind of indirect behavioral things. The mortgage interest deduction kind of encourages home ownership, but doesn't make you. There are some disincentives built into the tax system too, and really the tax system could be used even more powerfully if the government chose to. So for instance, you could have many, many, many rules from Environmental Protection Agency or whoever is imposing rules on fuel economy now and in the future. And you could make those very specific and very hard for manufacturers to comply with, or you could just tax the heck out of fuel, right? And customers would make their own decisions whether they still want to drive pickups and SUVs. We tend not to use the tax system today in that way. We tend to use other regulations to tell manufacturers how to build cars, and the tax system is a little more of an indirect tool, not a blunt instrument. So I have an interest because of what the tax system can do to affect behavior, but typically it is a more subtle tool rather than a bludgeon.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Jewell, and so I'm with DT Energy, and I've been in the energy sector pretty much my whole career. And so what makes that so fascinating is how energy is intertwined not only with our everyday lives, but regulation is all over the energy sector. And so my experiences and what we do as a company and all those things. So we go all the way from the markets, from the energy markets and how those operate and what those do, from trading, all the regulations that happen there, all the way to we have coal plants, and we have to work about the environmental issues and all the different agencies that we deal with on that front. We also have pipeline companies and storage, and so everybody's probably seen those kind of things when you try to build a pipeline, try to put that in somebody's backyard or go into a river and those kind of things. There's just a tremendous amount of regulation there. We also deal with a lot of the major federal entities like the FERC. You probably weren't aware, but the FERC actually didn't have a quorum in its first time for the last 7 months. There wasn't a quorum, so nothing actually was happening at the federal level to approve pipeline infrastructure and all those kind of things. So we were directly impacted because we were at a standstill on a $2 billion project, waiting for the political and the government and the regulation to sort of work around those things. Also, given my role as the corporate controller, I also deal with all of the financial markets and all the regulation that comes there. Just pull out a 10K, and that is nothing but regulation, determining what do we need to do, what do we got to write up, how do we make sure that the markets work effectively and those things, proxy statements. Sarbanes-Oxley, which is all the control and process stuff that we have to do in the documentation we do inside. I'm sure you get to deal with that too.
Yep.
And stuff. And so the industry that I'm in, just not only from the energy sector, but then also from a corporate public entity, deal with the financial markets. And so we deal with it quite a bit. I also had the privilege of being the chief risk officer at DTE when the economic crisis occurred. So I got to watch all of those types of things and going around. If you remember that, every day, every company puts their money into the CP market, like sort of house it overnight. Where during that, you couldn't get, if you put $1 in, they couldn't guarantee that you were going to get $1 out the next morning. Well, that sort of caused a lot of problems and all those types of things. So in my business and those things, you get to see a lot of places where regulation does make sense to help protect, keep the playing field level, also secure and monitor things. But on other sides of the house, you can see there's just a tremendous amount of burden to actually run a business and do what you need to do and those types of things. So, good.
Let me just give you my perspective from having spent, not so much from my Ford Motor Company days, but having spent several years now in government, and both at the state and federal level. And I think some of the challenges around regulation is that, rules and regulation is that, well, two things. Number one, there's the role of government in terms of actually imposing, if you will, rules and regulation effectively on government or on citizens. And they really do that in two ways. One is to encourage behavior, and the other is to try to, as my colleagues have said, regulate behavior, if you will, and to try to keep bad behavior from happening. And the second piece I'd make with that is that I think another cost of the rules and regulations is actually inside government. I think you'd find it interesting how much time government actually spends reporting to other elements of government in the same way that businesses have that burden. And so some of the challenges that really happen there, and the reason that I think really looking at and doing an overall assessment is important, but why I think it's so hard, and I think my colleagues can speak to this as well, is that unfortunately these regulations very often, number one, are built up over time. And they're also, unfortunately, sometimes a reaction to something that bad that has happened. So, we have a crisis, no matter what it is. You can go back to, pick a favorite that everybody knows, which is Enron. And so, government in an effort, Congress and certainly the executive branch in an effort to really try to be responsive to citizens, and really trying to say, hey, we're here to make a difference. We're here to try to do something. Well, actually, with all best intentions, attempt to do a set of regulations that will try to, number one, respond to that particular crisis, and number two, in many ways try to help that situation. And there's a couple things that happens. First of all, you get the unintended consequences. I mean, you can write the best regulation in the world, you can put it out for public comment, which is a requirement of government, but you never can exactly know what that burden's going to be. The second thing, which is really challenging, is that it's very difficult in any government situation to actually put that particular regulation in the context of every other regulation that's out there. And so consequently, companies, like Ford Motor Company and DTE are now faced with this kind of Rubik's Cube of a set of regulations that in many cases, they're faced with figuring out how those things fit together, when you would have liked to have said, I think, why didn't the government figure that out in the first place? And I think it's certainly not to justify it, but it's to try to put in context how this labyrinth of rules and regulations have actually sprung up. Also to put in context how difficult it is, and it's going to be, to actually try to pull some of those apart and get to that which is sensible, but also just to give some context around where some of these things are coming from.
Well, my history is puts me in I think a somewhat unique position. I spent 25 years in the auto industry, which is somewhat a regulated industry. A lot of time studying the economics of regulation, trying to study, the economics of a fuel tax versus changing the dynamic of the vehicle, CAFE regulations, safety regulations, a lot of those regulations that were hitting the auto industry, and trying to figure out how those were going to be implemented in a way in which they were doable, financially doable, and still maintain, profit margins. And also fighting regulators in ways in which, as was mentioned, it's hard to legislate behavior. How do you create a legislation that actually changes people's behavior, and the fact that consumers will adapt based on their needs? For example, what's happening in the industry today with SUVs and trucks as the price of gas fell. And so a lot of those things were modeled and we looked at and we saw, and I spent a lot of time studying that. Now I'm at the Federal Reserve and I find myself in a different position, in a position of trying to support the idea of certain regulations. Too big to fail, the banking industry, what's happened in the big financial crisis. And I find that now I'm looking at it through a different lens. So I think a lot of what one needs to remember about legislation, there is the registration itself, but there's also the enforcer, and then there's the interpretation. And I would imagine that this big game coming up on Saturday, there's some people that want one team to win and other people that want our team to win. And so that is kind of the focus you see as you start to deal with these regulations and which side of the issue you're on. Thank you.
By the way, if you notice, there are several people up here who have their degree from us. So our degree from us will definitely get you somewhere. It has some value.
Get you up here.
Just a plug.
Just a plug. I thought I'd throw that out there just in case. Get it on tape, we're good. Okay, I just dated myself there, get it on tape. Anyways, we talk a lot about the benefits. I mean, there's some talk about benefits of regulation and the counter-argument with the cost of regulation. Who are the benefactors of regulation? And if you give specific examples, that'd be great. But the other side of it is, who actually bears the cost of regulation? And talk a little about the cost side as well as the benefit side.
Well, I'll start with that. We all benefit. We all bear the cost. I've come from a school of studying economics for over 30 years. It's you pay me now or you pay me later. Either someone's going to pay that cost up front, or you're going to pay for that cost later on. You think about pollution, or I don't know what side of the global warming issue you're on, but at some point in time, you're going to pay that cost. it's going to come out in either higher prices, it's either going to come out in health issues, it's going to come out in cost for let's say health care down the road. So I think no matter how we address the issue up front, I think that if there is something that needs to be addressed, to say that it's one person's responsibility is difficult, and to say that only one person is actually paying for that because the regulation seems to be directed at them, I think is somewhat misleading, because prices will change, markets will change, and consumers will adapt to those regulations.
I think there's just a question of, is it a good regulation or a bad regulation? If it's a good one, it is kind of properly pricing in those, societal things, pollution, health, and so forth, to a net benefit to society. So if it's well designed, well done, there is a net benefit to society. But if it is a poorly written regulation that kind of misses the mark, there is a net cost that I assume we all pay. Fewer products, higher prices, fewer jobs, whatever. So there's good and bad regulation.
But I think that is part of the challenge is, in some cases, the intent is to sort of have the cost of that regulation be actually not passed on to the consumer in some senses. It's to really be able to move industry or any private sector organization to be able to do what the public needs, if you will. Unfortunately, in many cases, as my colleagues have said, that ends up getting passed on to the consumer. And the question is that balance between, how can companies afford to manage the cost of that regulation and not pass it on because the competitive market doesn't allow them to do that, which in effect then, is going to force some folks out of the market, versus those that can comply with the regulation and still be able to maintain, margins and still be able to be profitable. So, the purpose of regulation isn't to raise the price of everything in order to make the citizens have to pay for it, but it's rather to try to push the envelope in terms of that balance and who effectively can accomplish those regulations without. And in some cases, I think, to that point, from an industry perspective, it is going to raise prices across the board. In other cases, you're going to see actually companies hopefully become more effective at actually dealing with the intent of that regulation and not have to pass it on to the consumer.
Substituting for something they were otherwise doing,
Right.
rather than
Right.
adding on
Right.
to something.
And in some cases, I think it's to help improve efficiency. That's the intent in some cases, and some companies will be able to accomplish that, and other companies will not. And in that case, maybe it is, some benefits of the regulation, but there are others where, in fact, it does get passed on to the consumer. And I think in those particular cases, unfortunately, the consumer doesn't get to weigh in on whether that regulation, whether they would have preferred to pay for that regulation or they would have preferred not to. There's really not that dynamic.
Yeah, so my perspective is, like we talked about, like the health. Obviously we have coal plants and those kinds of things, and so you do need the government, because the government, through regulation and those kind of things, can look over a very long time. Essentially the next 200 years, kind of a thing. And so you do need regulation around environmental and those types of things. And yes, one industry is going to have to pay for that, and they pass that down into their customers and those things. But you're right, it's the net benefit across the long term that the government's trying to manage and trying to regulate. The thing that you have to keep in mind, though, is who sets those regulations. Those are political people. And political people, we're all people where sometimes we have views of what we think is right. And maybe that gets clouded on what the overall is. And that's where regulation becomes interesting, is where one special interest group or one group, instead of looking for this long term, what's the best thing for the United States, or North America, if you go to that kind of a frame, is what's the right thing over the long term. Well, certain groups may push different things on different groups and get their thing, which is then a short term sort of an item happen. Well, that's not positive regulation like we're talking about, because that's the short term, and then you're causing one group to pay for something that then you're benefiting, or you're subsidizing other parts of the economy, for some other political meeting and stuff. So those are the interesting things, like we talked about, with regulation. You're trying to do something to the government for a very long time. That's the best thing for society because one entity won't do it themselves. But then you get political involved, and that's what makes it fun, and that's what we get to deal with. So.
Yeah, that is the challenge, right?
Yep.
It's difficult to talk about regulations outside of a political context, and that's a whole different kind of a discussion. Maybe not for today, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. We'll Twitter that later.
Yeah, we'll talk
yes,
about that
yes.
later.
Well, I know with the DT situation, they're looking at regulations, but you're looking at infrastructure that's meant to last 50 or more years, and they're doing regulation that is meant to affect the next 5 sometimes. You've all talked about good and bad, positive, negative type regulations. And the benefactor and the person eventually facing the cost, bearing the cost, is actually all of us sitting here. We're both the benefactor and the person paying for it eventually. But are there examples of good and bad regulations, good regulations that had a good cost-benefit outcome, and then regulations that had a negative cost-benefit outcome? Can you think of specific examples of where it did work very well or it did not work very well?
I mean, you'd have to think that most safety regulation did what it was supposed to, that the benefits far outweigh either cost or inconvenience. So I think of things like tamper-proof, caps on pill bottles. Okay, that's a good thing. It's a minor annoyance that sometimes they're hard to open, but we'd all rather have it. Or sometimes when your plane can't leave because the pilot didn't have enough rest and they can't find another crew. I mean, that's an airline regulation that can be annoying, but I'm kind of glad it's there. So those are good ones, good purposes, minor annoyance. The good far outweighs the bad. Maybe an example of something that I know about at Ford from maybe 20 years ago is early regulation on airbags. Came in powerfully strong, right? You need airbags, and they need to be able to protect a male, unbelted occupant being rammed into a wall, basically, was the standard. Well, you meet that standard, and you are now injuring or killing children, the elderly, small women, and so forth. So that was a case of a safety regulation, well-intended, that went way over the mark, and that needs to be dialed back. So those are some I can think of.
So for mine, 2 examples is obviously our business, the utility business. We're highly regulated and those kind of things, and that's a good example of a regulation that you have to have. I mean, you can just imagine if all of us tried to meet our own energy needs every day, how inefficient and how costly that would be if each one of you had to build your own power plant in your backyard. With all the trying to regulate that, that just doesn't work. So obviously the regulation came about, and they, created that. All right, well, we're going to have these utility, sort of large scale, sort of energy providers and providers of the energy and those kinds of things. And so that's much more efficient for society. It's, much costlier or less costly and all those kind of things. So that's a good example of regulation. One that I have a lot of fun with all the time is just pick up a 10K of any company that's got derivatives, any type of derivatives, in their company. Pull open that 10K and look at that footnote and try to understand what that just told you. Are you going to buy or sell that stock price and what you think that just told you? I will pay you $1 if you can tell me what that just told you.
Same with the tax footnote.
Yeah, and the
Just
tax
try.
footnote, right. There's a lot of fun. They're really trying hard, but it came out of the economic crisis. Some of these trying to respond to something, thinking, boy, we need to regulate and we need more information on what that is. But nobody can understand what it is, even internally. We have discussions, and we're the experts on what that is. So that's an example of sort of over-regulating, again, trying to make it look good, and we're busy and we're doing something, but it dominates our 10K, and that's not really the essence of what regulation's supposed to do.
Yeah, I'll just give you one where I think the jury's still out. My world is information technology, and so if you're in information technology, cybersecurity, is clearly very, very high on the, on the topic and in the turn. The question is, can you regulate it? Should you regulate it? What do you do with it? But one of the things I'll just give you as a really small example, for instance, is that I work for a healthcare payer, a Medicaid payer, and one of the requirements that we had from the state was to have $1 million in cyber insurance. I'll tell you, I think the jury's still out on, number one, whether that's worthwhile. Number two, what behavior that actually is looking to drive and whether it is. And the second is, if you have a breach, what triggers the insurance and who pays who? And it was the other thing that was interesting is that it really raised some questions when you go out to actually try to get that insurance. The insurance providers aren't necessarily prepared to understand what that all means. So I just give you that as one which sort of has the flavor of being able to protect, but I'm not sure that in the mechanics that you really know how that's going to be implemented and effectively what the value would be.
I think I follow up on some of what Diane said. I don't want to really keep talking about the auto industry, but I did spend 25 years there. But I think we're going to talk later about the unintended consequence of a regulation. But you look at what happened to the auto industry when CAFE rules and safety rules first came out on automobiles. We started to create products that people really didn't want. So the intent of creating more fuel-efficient vehicles made the vehicles that lacked the utility people really wanted in their vehicles. Anybody ever seen the movie Family Vacation, and they all get in the family truckster and they drive across the planet? I mean, that's what we did when we were young. And those things weren't doable in the small, compact, fuel-efficient vehicles. So what happened? People started buying SUVs and larger vehicles because they weren't regulated the same way. They didn't have the same CAFE regulations that the cars did. And so in the outcome, you ended up people moving into product that was more dangerous, less fuel efficient, more polluting, because the regulation made the products they wanted really undesirable anymore. So I think that's that may be a little bit of a reach, but I think a lot of this transition from sedans and cars to more SUVs came about during this era when people were looking for utility. You want to be able to put your dog and your aunt on top and drive across the planet. And you couldn't do that in a small, compact car that was very fuel efficient.
I'm not going to respond to putting a dog in there.
I like my aunt.
I could really go there with
Obviously
something,
you
I'll just
haven't
leave it
seen Family
alone.
Or you and your aunt.
You love your family. Okay. By the way, there are small index cards and pens attached there for you. If you have individual questions you want to ask, probably in about 10 minutes or so, we have some student assistants who will pick that up and bring them forward so I can kind of group some questions together to see what your thoughts are. Earlier we talked about the DFCU conversation of small business and regulation. That kind of actually ties in with what we're doing partially here. We look at regulation and the public sees regulation as focusing on Fortune 500. They don't really realize sometimes that regulation hits almost all companies. Can you talk a little bit about the cost differences that would apply to a big organization relative to their income and a small company? How that affects those two sizes of company, big and small?
Well, it really comes down to economies of scale. If I can spread the cost of something over a multitude of products, then the cost per product is a lot lower. If I have a small mom and pop shop and I have to adhere to the exact same regulation as a major corporation that sells millions of what I sell hundreds of, then the cost per unit becomes a lot higher, and so you have to be able to spread that cost across a broader, so bigger companies can tend to absorb that a little more easily than small. We hear in the bank industry, everybody's familiar with, there was a recession a few years back, financial crisis, which brought back some regulation that once existed before. If you're familiar with the Glass-Steagall Act, which originally regulated commercial banks and prevented them from dabbling in investment type banking, that was repealed in 1999 by I think it's the Graham-Leach Bailey Act, yes, which actually repealed a lot of that. So we ended up with banks dabbling in areas, derivatives, and selling things they shouldn't be doing, and ultimately we ended up with a big financial crisis. And that financial crisis led to the Dodd-Frank Act now, which we are responsible for doing some of that checking of the banks, regulating of the banks. Well, if you're a small bank in a small community and you have to adhere to exactly the same rules as Bank of America does for too big to fail, for your processing, you have to even put an ATM in your windows because that's part of the law. All of a sudden, those costs become a lot more of an encumbrance. Now you have to hire somebody, another accountant, so that they can keep the books so that you can meet the regulations that are necessary. So you can see where a small bank would see that as a problem, where a large bank might be more easily be able to absorb that into part of their business. They may have somebody not doing anything already they can just put on it.
I asked one of my lawyer colleagues for examples, because I knew there would be many, of small business exceptions that revolve around how many employees do you have? Like, what are all the laws that Ford is subject to that small business is not, that are related to how many people do you employ? It included the Family and Medical Leave Act. So, for bigger companies, there's mandatory leaves for certain conditions, not for small. Family and Medical Leave Act, Civil Rights Act of 1964, ADEA, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, Americans with Disabilities Act. Pretty sure that Affordable Care Act has employment limitations. So there's lots and lots of things. Some of them make sense to me because in some cases you'd have to build in something that you just don't have the scale to build it in. Although why the Civil Rights Act shouldn't apply to a company with small number of employees or age discrimination, I don't know, but that's the way the laws have been written. It's interesting to see over the years where the threshold has moved from 10 to 15 to 20 to 25 to 50, kind of as the population, I guess, has grown. But it's just interesting that there are that many employee thresholds, some of which make sense to me, some of which really don't.
Yeah, so my perspective on that is what regulation does is it increases the barrier of entry for certain entities. In certain areas, you probably want that. Like we talked about the auto sector, you probably don't just want any one of us getting together, building up a car, and then you can just turn around and sell that to anybody. I mean, there's a lot of safety regulations you want in that vehicle, and therefore you sort of push that only the largest companies that are able to afford and handle those things, from a safety standpoint. But I think where it really gets down into the small business owners, if you just want to open up a pizza shop, it's not just you go buy little pizza and that kind of stuff. You've got all kinds of this other regulation of reporting and all kinds of different things that you have to do that I question, does it really help with some of the safety? Does it help with some of these larger things? And that's where you get after the small businesses, is where they have all these reporting requirements, kind of things that come on with it. And you do have to hire another accountant or a lawyer. You got to do all these kinds of things just to run a pizza shop. And that's where regulation starts, messing with the economy, as it was mentioned in the first. The U.S. economy is substantially built on small businesses. And if you continue to raise that barrier of entry on small businesses, then you're going to push them into nothing but the other. Well, that's where you lose innovation, is when you take that away from each of us as individuals and what we're all about here in the U.S. That's not a good thing for the long-term success, and that's not the role of government. It's supposed to be about the long-term sustainability of the society, not sort of the short-term piece.
So a little bit I didn't realize Civil Rights Act is not required for small business. It should be required for everything. Wow. Okay. So, are there industries out there that actually need more regulation, where the public is currently not protected, needs some benefit? Any thoughts on that?
Maybe phrased slightly differently, maybe not needs regulation, but a gaping hole right now is autonomous vehicles, right? There is no regulation now for how do you put driverless vehicles on the road, with what rules, with what protection for pedestrians and animals and, whatever. And that's a case in which, to your point, you don't want everybody out there doing something different. You don't want 50 states to start filling in that space, because now as a manufacturer, it's just impossible to build and sell something with 50 states regulating. So that's a place where you would want, cooperatively with the federal government, to figure out long-term, what are the rules of operation of driverless vehicles going to be, because it's too big, it's too dangerous to have everybody figuring it out on their own.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think that's a great topic, because right now the states really are looking individually at legislation, and in fact have been passing individual legislation, number one. But number two, the other piece of the autonomous vehicle question from a state government perspective or from a government perspective is that it will require changes to the infrastructure. And we all talk, you've all heard the question around, what is it going to cost, and name your state, but even within Michigan, how much is it going to cost to fix Michigan roads? Just from the standpoint of potholes and being able to drive vehicles. And now we have the question of what is it going to cost to put sensors in? What is it going to cost to really be able to do what we all love to talk about in the tech world, which is the new Internet of Thing buzzword, but as it applies to what is going to be required. And so I think that's another aspect that maybe not pure regulation, but is going to be a challenge that's going to be faced, and something that I think gets a little bit dwarfed in the glamour of autonomous vehicles, right?
Well, one of the things that jumps out at me, I have a young 12-year-old son, is the internet. I have to regulate him. I'm the supervisor. I have to control what he sees, what he doesn't see. I have to make sure he doesn't get somewhere I don't want him to get. There's a lot out there that I'm fearful of, that he could end up getting in contact with an individual that I don't want him to be in contact with, or seeing something that I don't want him to see. And the other thing, and I don't know if we should go there, but I'm going to, because we're all adults here, is what just recently happened in Las Vegas. I mean, here we have an issue that, as much as we want to believe tobacco and firearms is regulating the industry, we still having issues of this nature. How do we address that in a way in which, as a society, we can all feel like we're being fairly treated? So those are two areas I think that need a lot of work.
So for me, again, at the energy sector is when you think about, like the environment and those types of things. When you talk about regulation, you got at the federal level, you got the state, and then of course you got down all the counties and cities and all those kind of things. But when you think about the environmental policy, one thing we don't have here currently in the United States is a holistic energy policy and environmental policy. We've got some of those laws, those have been sort of put on stay and all those kind of things. Well, then when the federal government doesn't step in, sort of regulate that or come up with what is the overall policy, well, then each state is then going to come up with its own policy. And that's okay. The problem is with when you're talking about the environment and those kind of things, when, like California, let's just pick California because that's a fun place, they're regulated and they're going to go totally to solar and wind and all that stuff, which is just awesome until the sun doesn't shine at night and when the wind doesn't blow. So they need backup. Well, who then provides that backup for them? Well, it's Arizona and stuff. You got to have the energy when you need it, but when you don't have a federal policy, then what you're doing is you're going to regulate within your borders, which you can, but then that's maybe not the right thing, because then Arizona's, they're going to have to meet their everyday needs, because at 4 a.m., you might want to turn your lights on. Well, somebody has to be able to provide that power, and they're going to do it a certain way. And so there's certain places where you need the federal government to sort of overlay across the states, and then energy policy is probably one good example, to sort of help the states on the overall what's going on. Otherwise, you get to a sub-optimized sort of solution over the very long term.
Yeah, particularly for companies, pretty much all small to medium size, or medium to large size companies that are really operating across multiple states, even
Yep.
if you don't operate across the United States,
Right,
that
right.
becomes a real challenge.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, insurance. That
Yeah.
insurance is another very interesting one. Each state, like USAA, different insurance companies, each state's got its own regulations. So you think about the cost of doing that. Every state, they got to go new regulations, different thing, and all those kind of things. Well, if there's a federal sort of an overall policy that sort of manage that, that'd be so much more efficient. You get the exact same products, but that'd be a lot more efficient from the paperwork and all that type of stuff.
You talk about between states. Within my industry, public accounting, auditor liability is state by state by state. And so cost of audit service is different state by state by state because of the cost of regulation they face. It's quite some massive differences. And you talked a little about state. Are there times or situations where state and local it's better to come in with the regulation, develop regulation, than at the federal level? You talked about, yes, with energy, we should have a federal energy policy. But there are situations where the state should step in as opposed to the federal government, where they would have an advantage to the regulation.
There we go. So
Go
I'll
ahead.
keep going on that one. So then, so like in the regulated utility sort of a sector, which because the local government of the state is much more closer to its constituents. The people understanding what's going on in the state, and so that from a regulation of the utility sector, I believe that's much better done at a local, essentially at the state level, to be able to manage that. Because if you tried to manage that at the federal level, that'd just be too much. They wouldn't be able to do that because again, they're trying to regulate up here all the way down to each one of us as citizens, and the state is much more adept to be able to do that given the representation and those types of things. So I think that's one example where that does make sense.
Yeah, I think there are also examples or cases where in the actual implementation of a particular reg and how it's actually done in a particular jurisdiction needs to be under the control of that jurisdiction, while in fact there may be an overarching federal approach to it. Let me just give you an example. I sit on the board of a group called, or an organization called FirstNet. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not. But coming out of the 9/11 Commission, one of the challenges for first responders, and this has really actually been exacerbated by some of the natural disaster issues on top of some of the the items that were just discussed. There's really not an interoperable, in a techie term, public safety communication capability across the country. Every state, and in many cases, state and local jurisdictions pick their own technologies, which is fine on a day-to-day basis, but there's not necessarily a way when you have first responders flocking to a particular area that they can communicate with each other. So the federal government has a nationwide effort to actually build out a public safety interoperable network. And that is something that I've been working on. But the implementation of that will actually be on not only an individual state basis, but each local community will make the decision, how to come on, how much they can spend, and how they actually do the implementation. Now that's early days. We're just getting rolled out, but it's just kind of to present the concept of doing something at the federal level, but also thinking about that implementation really needing to be customized and selected and decided on in the individual jurisdictions that actually use it.
Education might be another example. I know very little about it, but we know that the feds do something in education, and that comes, right down to state and local. And whether that's a good partnership or there's a little too much Fed or a little too little federal, I don't really know, but it's another one I think of that could come local.
There's, with the vastness of this country and the diversity of the economies, where you have manufacturing in some areas and you have agriculture in other areas, the needs for education can vary. The University of Michigan-Dearborn is real good at trying to create engineers that service the auto industry because we're highly concentrated in those fields in this region. So, that behooves them to have the resources necessary from the state to do those kinds of things. And and then there's land management that is going to be different whether you live in a desert or if you live in northern Michigan. And if you have a herd of cattle and you want to protect those cattle, they'll be different from different regions of the world depending on the various different kinds of predatory animals that may exist. So regional and local kind of authority sometimes becomes imperative.
Thank you. I got a series of audience questions, and they all surround basically politics now. So, they talked a lot about the cost of business, increasing jobs, overburden of regulation. What's your view so far of Congress, White House comments on the way regulation is going to go? Can it actually produce more jobs without loss of benefit? Change in tax structure, all those things, repatriation of money, which is a huge issue for us. What are your views on Washington's action or inaction on changing regulation?
I guess I can try that one. It would be a whole nother day, I think, to talk about U.S. tax reform. That is a huge subject, and I don't call that regulation. I call that making laws. That's Congress. So I think today is more about the administration and the regulators. And on the tax side, just yesterday, actually, the administration announced that about 7 or 8 regulations that were put in place in the last 2-3 years would either be withdrawn or substantially modified because they went too far. None of them are of great interest to Ford, but for instance, you've probably all heard of corporate inversions, where in order to sort of escape the U.S. tax system that was kind of built in the 1950s and really does need an overhaul, some companies are acquiring foreign parentage, right, in order to have the benefits of being foreign-owned rather than U.S.-owned. So one everyday brand that you know of is Burger King is no longer an American owned company. It's owned by Tim Hortons, which is a Canadian company. And there were tax benefits to being foreign owned. And it's not illegal. That's absolutely fine. But after a number of companies, Walgreens is now owned by Boots, the UK, drugstore chain, and lots of examples of companies that were inverting perfectly legally, rationally, and so forth. IRS came out with just buckets of regulations to try to prevent companies from doing that. You can't make it illegal, but you can add just a whole bunch of things that make it miserably hard to do that. But in trying to catch the Burger Kings and the Walgreens, and there was a drug company that was on the verge of doing it, they also swept up Ford Motor Company in very ordinary, everyday things it does. We would have suddenly had, you just say hundreds and thousands of hours of compliance stuff for no good reason. We were just swept up in this big thing. That's the kind of thing that our current president campaigned on. He wasn't thinking about that in particular, but was just thinking about these overreaches, overreactions to whatever it was, Enron, or in this case, corporate inversions. And so they're making an attempt, and I think doing it fairly intelligently, to pick the most egregious cases of tax regulations gone gone wrong and dial them back. Sometimes withdrawing, sometimes dialing back. I think that's a good thing. I see it happening.
What would your predictions be on 12 months from now? Let's be a little more generous. 24 months from now, do you believe we'll see any major regulation changes within the U.S.? Just a free, open question. Nobody makes predictions anymore.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think to kind of step a little bit back to your last question, I mean, I'm making comments here. I should have started by saying these are my views and not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank, because I don't want it to come back that the Fed says. But I think one of the things I've seen in the surveys that we've done, if you look at business attitudes, there was a real boost at the end of the year, near the end of the election, that so much was going to get done. Business leaders felt, oh boy, we're going to get tax reform, we're going to get tax cuts, regulations are going away, this is going to be great. The stock market responded to it. I don't know if anybody watched the stock market. The hours that at the end of the election, the markets fell, the futures fell by 1,000 points and closed the next day 500 points up. There was a huge switch in attitudes that the new administration was going to make things change. As we went through the year, we're seeing not much happening. And so I guess the question is, what will happen? And we're starting to see business attitudes starting to drift down a little bit. Opportunities may be gone. It's like the day before your birthday party and you know what's in the box, and when you open the box, it really is something different than what you thought you were going to get. It's really difficult to say whether you're going to see a lot of change as we go further into 2018. When you start to talk politics, again, not the view of the Fed, because we do monetary policy, we do not do fiscal policy, we're getting now into another cycle. I mean, by the end of this year, we're into the 2018 cycle already. And people will start running for office for 2018. And so as you get further down the road, the farther away from Inauguration Day, the harder it gets to actually do the things that you promised early on.
Let me just say, number one, I remain hopeful. I think that, we really have to look at how the political system works and how government works. But I will say that one of the challenges, I think, to the point that was made, is to really try to change the rhetoric from the polarization that we're seeing today. In order to be able to get some of the changes, particularly those that require legislative action, as opposed to what the agencies themselves can do from just an edict perspective, or what can be done from an executive order perspective, and those are just some mechanisms of getting things done. In order for those things to change from a legislative perspective, there's actually going to have to be less polarization and more collaboration. I think that's what we're seeing, in terms of the way that Congress moves. And I think the other challenge is that the agencies and the federal agencies themselves can do a certain amount in terms of either, rolling back legislation, rolling back regulation, or looking at new regulation. The key thing is that when they do that really without the benefit of while it may be an onerous legislative process, there still is a certain amount of debate and a certain amount of consideration. So as the agencies look to roll back regulation, my hope is that it's going to be done in that same thoughtful way that considers all of, the benefits and the ramifications, to ensure that we're actually making good policy change and are not really doing it from the standpoint of what's reactionary.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing I sure like, just the acknowledgement that we may have too much regulation just by saying it makes them think about, all right, well, geez, why are we filling that out 4 times? Maybe we can do it once, or those types of things. And so I think that's very positive. Again, every administration comes through, and there'll be another 50 in our lifetimes. They'll all say that and all those kind of things. But this one, they seem to be sort of trying to work on it. And so I think from the time frame, I think the legislation, they've got to do something here in the next couple couple of months, or at the elections, they're political animals. It'll all get snarled up and they'll stop. But the hope is, as the regulator, everybody's sort of below sort of the political world, that they keep working on the regulation, those kind of things. And I think some of the secretaries that are up there and so like that, they've actually had real jobs, done real things, and those kind of things. Well, they just having some, new people sort of look at something and go, well, that doesn't seem to make sense. Well, why are we doing it? Well, just stop it. Those types of things. So I think there's going to be sort of this trickle kind of going on that's happening. And the one that I think that I see is from the banking. There seems to be sort of that, they're talking about, they just released AIG, sort of brought them off of, you remember that from the economic crisis, had to prop them up and all those types of things. Well, they've kind of backed off some of those kind of things and stuff like that. So I think that's what you're going to see.
The financial ones and the tax ones are a little easier to start
Right.
with because nobody's going to die, right?
Exactly. Right. Yep. Right.
Couple of, again, questions from the audience.
It's just money.
Just money? Yeah. Okay. There's some questions from the audience continuing. With Equifax, what's kind of interesting to Equifax was that in Washington, pushing for deregulation, even though it was 8 months after a breach. Will the Equifax situation be a situation where we're going to see more regulation in that industry? Any predictions on that? Or how would they regulate it to make it to help give a benefit as opposed to just regulate because there's a crisis?
Yeah, I guess let me just talk about it from a cybersecurity perspective, because I think you can talk about Equifax as it relates to any of their other activities, but I mean, clearly the most recent press that's been out there is around the breach and, around their lack of actually looking internally at their technology, quite frankly, which is what caused the problem. Interestingly enough, I'm not seeing, certainly any active move to talk about what would be the regulation, partially because I think it's really hard to determine how you tell a company how to run their technology in a way that is secure, in a way that you can actually monitor it and know whether that is secure or not. So I think that, we're going to continue to see an interest, because there is increasing interest on the Hill around what do you do around the cybersecurity question. It's been particularly, of course, something that you've all heard about because it also impacts things like elections and influence of the public. So you're going to continue to see some interest in regulation of some companies that effectively have a global reach in terms of disseminating information and how that's going to work. But I think it's going to be difficult. Let's put it this way. I think there's going to be a lot of noise. There's going to be a lot of publicity and a lot of press. I think it's going to be very difficult to regulate companies in a way to actually tell them how can the government look at what you are doing with your technology to ensure that you're protected. Now, having said all of that, again, being a technology person, there has to be something done. I mean, I think the level of technology investment that companies are really putting in to ensure that all of our information is secure really needs to be something that companies need to look at. Now, whether that needs to be regulated or not is a part of this whole discussion. But again, hopefully, companies are really taking this seriously. They are really looking at that level of investment, and they're thinking about that level of investment in terms of things like, their corporate credibility, their roles and responsibilities as it relates to, their citizens and to their customers. So I think it's a tough one, but I think it's something that companies need to be looking at.
Yeah, I agree. That is such a tough thing to do. You talk about the Equifax, but then also, think about the SEC. Remember, the SEC got hacked in. And of course, they weren't looking for 10Ks and all that stuff. What they were looking for is, if you're going to do a merger, acquisition, you're going to do those kind of things, you have to file that first, and the SEC goes through that and figures that out. Well, if you can get that information before the rest of the market does, well, you have, information that everybody else doesn't have, and those types of things. And so this whole hacking of information all the way from your Social Security card to all the way to the SEC or the, you just think about how large that is, and trying to figure out how you're going to regulate that in a responsible way. That's massive. How to do
Well, and
that.
nobody doesn't want to do it, right? There's no company that says, I don't care about securing.
Right.
It's just, you don't know where the attacks are coming from. Like,
I do think,
it's not
though,
like you're trying to change a reluctant,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, right.
It's
exactly.
like you're
Yeah,
trying
right.
to get ahead of something that you don't know where it's coming
Yeah,
from.
right. Yep.
Yeah, I think the challenge is the question around the level, for all companies, the question of level of investment and how that actually fits within your overall portfolio of what you're going to spend on, and making sure that there is adequate prioritization, right?
And you hit, it's cost. It's how much does it cost me to do it? And is there a role that government could play in helping that cost be making it more affordable? I mentioned regulating the internet. I mean, there's a cost to any, one thing you'll learn in Econ 101, everything comes at a cost, right? And so how do you spread that cost over the society so that we all benefit equally? I would imagine, I could look down this room, that pretty much everybody in this room got hacked, right? 150-some million out of 300 million adults, so pretty close. If you didn't get hacked, your wife got hacked. And if it isn't this time, it'll be somewhere else down the road, and there's a cost to preventing that, and do we benefit from that cost as a society, and is it worth incurring that cost?
One of the things that actually was nowhere on my list, but one of the audience question is talking about the role of lobbyists in the regulation process. Good, bad, indifferent. But basically describe their role. Are there situations where we have lobbyists who are pushing a certain thing, especially relative to large and small businesses, where it could be a disadvantage of small businesses? But in general, can you talk about the lobbyist role within regulation?
It almost doesn't fit with, well, I will take the word almost out. It doesn't fit with my experience because, for instance, on tax subjects, I am the lobbyist, right? I am the one that goes and tells Ford's story to Congress or the regulators, and so it's kind of an alien concept. We know our story. We best tell our story. Members of government agencies and Congress want to hear our story, and best to hear it from me and not from a mouthpiece that I've hired. So I'm not sure what kind of industry or size of company it is that would hire a lobbyist.
Yeah, that is a really interesting one, because again, when you think about Congress, that's who you're trying to talk to, or the administration, not the judicial system, that sort of side, but the other two sides of the House. They've got limited amount of time, and so you can't have every one of us as individuals run up there and talk to them about your interests and stuff. And so lobbyists play an interesting role to be able to help tell the story of lots of industries. And so again, you're right, but there are industry groups
There are
around, coalitions around tax, or around the auto, around the energy sector, around all kinds of stuff. The gun manufacturers, all of them telling their story and trying to help get there, because you can't have every one of us as individuals going up there. So there's definitely a role, just by the way our system sort of works. There's a role for that. Is that the problem is you've got those are individuals, and those individuals and those companies might have short-term views and those things, and they might influence or do those kind of things, or help influence some to make short-term decisions sort of in line with them, because they're lobbying for their group. And again, the purpose of government is to sort of level the playing field. Well, if you've got a lobbyist that's sort of tilting that scale or sort of pushing their agenda, you could tip the scale. Well, again, that's tipping it against what the purpose of what our government is sort of set up to do. So there's a real benefit to it, but then there can also be a downside just because we're humans and potentially how they could push the scales away from the overall benefit to society.
One of the comments was dealing with NAFTA and the move to renegotiate NAFTA. Your thoughts on, are there things we can change in NAFTA that would help the U.S.? But at the same time, is there a cost to overall North America if that occurs? Any views on NAFTA?
Probably yes to all of that, but I'm not a NAFTA expert. Yes, I think there are things that can be changed because, as with any agreement, it gets dated after a time, and there are things to rethink. Do they work in a modern era? Do they work for digital services as opposed to, traditional manufacturing? The Republicans tried last year. They had an earlier tax platform they called the Blueprint that included a fairly radical idea called a border adjustment tax that would kind of have, blown up NAFTA through the tax system. It would have said anything you bring across a border, and a border includes Canada and Mexico. So any imported vehicle from Mexico or Canada, of which there are a lot for all of the OEMs, and then sold in the U.S., let's say, would not be a deductible purchase, right? So if you bought a Ford Edge from Canada, I'll just make up a number, for $20,000 and sold it for $25,000, normally you would think the profit on which you're paying tax is $5,000. But under this border adjustment tax, it would say, no, you're going to pay tax on $25,000. You get no credit for something that you bought and brought across a border. What would that do? That would incentivize manufacturing in the United States. It would disincentivize doing it in Mexico and Canada. So it was a different approach to boosting the U.S. economy. It was quickly rejected because of heavy lobbying by, Walmart and Target and Macy's and so forth. Where do you think they get the products that you all buy? China, Vietnam, and it would have killed them. It would have either killed them or cost, consumers more because the prices of everything you buy at Walmart would have had to go up. So there's a lot going on there. So that particular approach died. It was just too big a change for the U.S. But I think NAFTA will be changed around the edges. I would be shocked if it's radical, but I think it will be tweaked.
Are there, this is probably my last question, are there regulations that are meant for one industry that have a significant impact on other industries that the regulation was never meant for? Are there examples of that? Okay, this is a bad question to have that.
No, it's a good question. I just can't think of one.
Other than Dodd-Frank, yes.
Yes. Not to backtrack, but just on the NAFTA thing a little bit. I have studied NAFTA quite a bit for the auto industry. I think one of the things we must remember in that regard is businesses are very adaptive. Ford Motor Company has a product chain, a supplier chain, a process, a business plan that's put in place that takes years to develop and years to implement. Quick changes to the rules of the game make it very difficult for businesses to plan for the future. And so when you look at changing something as significant as that, how does that impact the plans that have been in place in some of these major organizations and have taken years to implement and have a very long-reaching. There's investments that have already been made. There's costs that have already been incurred based on a certain rule of the games, and that's part of the problem with some of regulations is that they don't all come with sunset clauses. They don't all come with points in time where we're going to review them and look at them and say, are they still applicable for this point in time? And so they stay locked in place for long periods of time because businesses have interests in keeping them in place because their product plan or their business plan or the way they're doing business is set up for a longer horizon than a quick change would allow them to financially absorb.
Any other final comments?
No, I was just mentioning, you think about, NAFTA and with the implications. We just think about Britain and the EU. That's a pretty good example. You just sever ties with everybody thinking you can just do your own thing. Well, just look at all the turmoil and all that stuff that goes through. And that exact same thing, I believe, would happen here in the U.S. We just said, we're going to do something different of that, just on a whim like that, like they sort of did, not over a 20-year period. Just did it done. That would unravel and really disrupt a whole bunch of stuff. And, it'd eventually work itself out, but the short term, it would be very disruptive.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate all of you being here. I'd like to especially thank DFCU Financial for sponsoring this event. Murray Feldman for being here today from WWJ. Of course, thanking the panelists with Terry, Diane, Paul, and Jeff, and about a half dozen other people from the COB who helped me. Gail Reeves did some significant work for us. Chris Dunning, Adam Zahel, Michael Kamen. They've all, these four individuals have really helped me put this together. I get up here and ask questions, and they run around doing a lot of work. I'm very grateful for all of your help. The next event is November 30th, working with, looking at workforce issues, how to attract and retain employees, talented employees, high-level employees. We have four very different industries coming in within engineering, technology, automotive, coming in to talk about how they keep their employees. And again, thank you, and we'll see you November 30th.